going live.
Okay.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me today for our delving deeper into Jewish prayer.
Amen.
Excellent. Okay. With this series, just as a recap, what are we doing here? With this series, we are looking at the tefillot, at the prayers that we go through every single day within the Jewish prayer services. And we are going through them word by word or sentence by sentence. And the reason that we're doing that is to show how chock full of depth and meaning each one of these prayers, I don't like the word prayer, I've said that before, but each one of these prayers, how deeply they go. And when I say how deep they go, I mean on a spiritual level, of course, but also on a psychological level, that the goal of our daily services that we have in Judaism in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, is really each one in its own right is supposed to be a transformative experience. If there's a statement I once heard that our prayers are not to change God, our prayers are to change ourselves. And if we go through a service, if we are able to go through an entire davening, and at the end of it come out and we are unchanged from the experience, then it hasn't been a real experience. We haven't experienced what the tefillot and the prayers are all about. Now, part of the challenge there, as we've discussed before, is that generally, tefillah, Jewish prayer, is done in Hebrew, just like I keep calling it tefillah. And I think it's great if everyone calls it tefillah, right? Just, in English, we would say meditation. But I'm sure in other languages, there are different terms for meditation. In Hebrew, there are two specific ones. One is called hidbonenut, which means more of an intellectual meditation that let me contemplate a single subject and focus on it and turn it over and try to extract the academic depths of that statement. And then there's another one called hidbonenut, which is more of an introspective experience. This is closer to what, or hidbodidut, sorry, not hidbon, that's the first one, hidbodidut, which it's much more of a personal experience. It is much closer to what the Western world would call meditation. And it has to do with, or connects to the word levad, which means alone. It is about connecting to yourself and your inner experience and your inner life, and truly the inner connection and relationship that we all have with God. Whether or not we are aware of that relationship, we all have it. Some would call that the soul experience or soul consciousness or anything of that genre. It has to do with our consciousness, the way we perceive the world and experience the world within our lives. Tefillah is no different. The goal is to recognize our deep connection to the underlying consciousness that is in the world. According to Jungian psychoanalysis, this is what is called the collective consciousness. There are other levels of that. There are national consciousnesses. There are spiritual and religious collective consciousnesses. There are familial collective consciousnesses. I think that's the word. Consciousnesses is very awkward to say. So that's what we're doing here. We're trying to say how these daily tefillot, our daily prayers, are really there about connecting us as Jews to the Jewish collective consciousness, but also to God and the universal collective consciousness. This is not just about me. This is not just about us. This is about everybody. And it's an amazing thing that really the more we involve ourselves in the depths of of consciousness that went into forming and creating the Jewish prayers, the more we are able to attune ourselves and align ourselves with the underlying emet, the underlying truth that is in all people, in all places, in all nationalities and cultures, that ultimately recognizing it all comes from the same singular source. Now, what is that same singular source? Well, in the Western world, we would tend to call that God. God is very loaded. And I believe I've said this before. When we think about God, we tend to think about Zeus, or at best, the guy on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel who was modeled after Zeus. That is God in man's image, right? Thinking about the idea of God as a man on a cloud with a long white beard, possibly a very deep voice, and, you know, who is kind of just watching things go on and somehow knows things, that's challenging, right? For a Jewish conception of God, that is a very challenging image, because that is not what we perceive of as God. God is simultaneously everything and everyone and everywhere, right? God would be the guy in the cloud with the beard as much as God would be the cloud, as much as God would be the levels of consciousness that are able to pervade and integrate and unify all of our consciousnesses, because God is that unified consciousness and mind and existence, etc., etc. It is far bigger than something that we can conceptualize of. And this is, of course, according to the way I understand it, there are certainly other ways that that Jewish rabbis and historians and philosophers have perceived of God. But I will say that this, to me, rings truest. And not only that, it is the most consistent when it comes to looking at and understanding every type of Jewish source and Jewish philosophy and thought process. This works when you study Kabbalah. This works when you study halacha, right? When we study Jewish mysticism, when we study Jewish law, when we study the Talmud, which is Jewish thought. It is the encyclopedia of Jewish thought and ways to understand Torah and Judaism and the world and God. It is encyclopedic knowledge. This definition of God and godliness, for me, works the best and is the most consistent throughout all of these different levels and frameworks of understanding. And it works best with the idea of God is one. Now, we are currently in a section of our tefillot that we call the Birkot Kriyat Shema, the blessings that precede the recitation of Shema Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, we're not going to go into it in depth today, but Shema Yisrael is the mission statement of the Jewish people, and it ends with the words HaShem Echad, God is one, right? And all of these paragraphs that we will be engaging with, all of these tefillot, these blessings, this imagery that we're going to be seeing over the next couple of months, I would say, until we actually get to that statement of Hashem Echad, God is one. It's all going to be focused on that idea. All of it is going to be pointing us in that general direction. And so this is going to be something that's going to come up over and over and over again. How do we perceive of God's unity? Now, we're going to go into the first blessing that opens this section of our tefillot. If you are following along in the Siddur, we are using the English Hebrew Art Scroll Siddur, Nusach Ashkenaz, and we are on page 84. The same thing can be found, I believe, on page 404 during Shabbat, but right now, oh, I'm sorry, it's 406 on Shabbat. Regardless, the same words are found in both places. We're going to analyze this first bracha. Now, before we can look at this bracha, we need to understand and review again, what is a bracha? Last week, we spoke extensively about this idea. We talked about the idea of Baruch et HaShem HaMivorach and Baruch HaShem HaMivorach Le'olam Va'ed. Here, translated poorly, I always say, but it's very hard in any translation. Bless Hashem, the Blessed One, and blessed is Hashem, the Blessed One, for all eternity. And I said, what is blessed, and what does it mean to be mivarech, to give a blessing? The idea of a bracha and the word baruch, as we said last week, comes from the Hebrew shoresh, the same root as the word for knees, berech, right? Like the knees that allow us to bend down, right? And it comes from the same root as the word for a pool of water, a berecha, right? Same root in Hebrew. And just like a pool of water happens at the lowest point, the water flows down into the pool. And just like our knees allow us to bend down and draw us down and closer to the earth, so too the idea of a bracha is a way to actively bring godliness down into the earth, right? Into our lived experience. At the very beginning of today's class, I took a drink of my bottle of water. For branding issues, I should not show you the name. I don't care. I love when I crack myself up. It's the best thing in the world. It's good that I can see other videos here with me that are also laughing. That's very helpful. Anyway, when I took a drink of this water, which I will do again, at the beginning, I said a bracha. What was that bracha doing? Is that just thanks God for the water? Very good and hydrating and very important. Well, yes, it's doing that, but there's more to it. The bracha is acknowledging and, as it were, bringing out the godliness that is the source of this water. If Hashem is Echad, if God is one, and God is truly pervading and pervasive in all things at all times, so God is in this water as much as God is in my heart and soul, right? And as much as God can be found in these prayers and in the Torah and in all of our lived experiences, God is in this water. So what can I do as an individual to connect to that godly source of the water, to really bring things back to their unified source? So we make a bracha. We bring down or extract or bring out or just simply recognize the godliness and the transcendent will that comes into having something called water, putting it into this liquid form that I can then ingest and hydrate myself, and the whole process that got it into this plastic bottle that's terrible for the environment, and then allowing me to drink that water. All of those processes, as they come together, recognizing that from the top down, as much as I can think about it on a physical level, so too on a spiritual level, I need to acknowledge the source. And that's what we're doing. When we make a bracha, we're acknowledging the source. And we are not just acknowledging the source, but we are connecting ourselves and our actions and our behaviors to that source, which, again, we colloquially in the Western world refer to as God. You will hear when I talk about God, I often use HaShem. HaShem, while it has been a Jewish term for God, and sometimes people even write it out, Hey, Shin, Mem, which just says HaShem. In English, that actually means the name. It is referring to God's four-letter name, which also we talked about last week a little bit. We don't pronounce that four-letter name. It was only ever pronounced by the high priest in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur 3 times every Yom Kippur in a row, in the context of a verse in the Torah. But we don't pronounce it. And we say that is the transcendent name. When we say HaShem Echad, we are saying that transcendent name of God encapsulates everything transcendent and everything immanent. That is everything above and beyond the universe and known and what's the word I'm looking for? And quantum chances of existence, right? So when we think about the universe or the multiverse or what's going on inside black holes, and do they open up to new universes and new black holes or into other ones, and what's the deal with the ripples in the space-time continuum and blah 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 blah. When we think as big as we can think of, for us, HaShem means all of that stuff and everything that is beyond all of that stuff and whatever that is and or might mean. It is beyond our perception and our ability to perceive of it, but that, we say, is the same source that pervades this water, right? And so that's why we just say HaShem, because you can't really name it. You can't point your finger to it. It's too big. It's too expansive. So it's just HaShem. It's the name, right? I can't give it a name. So it's just the name. And Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the name that we do ascribe to God that we don't pronounce, when we study that name, there are books and books and books written about just that name and trying to understand the depth of imagery and symbolism that name and the letters that are used to put it together really comes to represent. It is something that has layer upon layer and overlapping metaphor upon overlapping metaphor, and in our historical Jewish texts that talk about it, say it is almost inter-included to the infinite degree. That is, you can find the imagery of one letter, and all of the letters and their individual imageries can be found in each one of the letters, and that goes on to various depths and levels of metaphor. Now, I feel like I'm talking a little bit too vaguely right now because we're not studying the name of HaShem. We're not studying Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Maybe one day. There are classes available. You can find it online. There are books available. But be careful with your sources if you do go looking for that stuff. There's a lot of misinformation as well. Anyway, moving right along. This is the source. It is a one unified source. And so we start off and we say Baruch, right? We start with a blessing saying, I'm going to draw whatever that source, that singular source of existence, and have it come down into this world and into my experience. There's a question that was just put into the chat. We'll get there in just a moment. Okay. So that's Baruch. I'm bringing it down. I'm connecting whatever I have in my life, in my hand, in my perception of life, to it, the source of that perception. And then we say the word Ata, you. Just like I'm talking to you and you are listening to me, but from your perspective, you would say, I am listening to you, right? Just like we are having this direct connection and communication right now, so too, when we are saying these brachot, when we are saying blessings, we are having that direct communication with that source. So when I say Baruch Ata, I'm bringing you, source of all things, into my experience. I have a personal relationship, as do you, right? We all have a relationship with everything around us. We talked about this last time in terms of the levels of consciousness and awareness, in terms of how we relate to the things we have in our lives and how we establish and connect to those relationships. So we have a relationship with God in the same way. But David, I can't see God, and you know, I don't hear God talking back to me. Is that really a relationship? Well, of course, right? There's such a thing as a relationship. My book doesn't talk back to me, but I can really say, like, oh, I just really enjoyed learning you, right? I have sidurim that I love to pieces. Literally, the covers are falling off, pages are torn and all curled up in the corners. These are my favorite sidurim to pray from, to daven from, because I have such a relationship with them. Some of them have notes, they have things underlined, they have a connection with historically the tefillot that I have prayed with those books, right? That's the idea of a relationship, when we have an interaction and an interplay. And the idea is that God does have a relationship with us, and God does speak to us through ourselves and our own hearts and our own feelings and our own expressions. That's why tefillah is so powerful, because we are expressing our direct, you and me, relationship with God. And God is expressing the same relationship back to us through these words. Then we get back to God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. So we are now saying, I have a relationship with you, God the transcendent, God that is above and beyond all things, God that is the essential source of everything. Now, the question that was put in the chat is, do we know the origin of Yud Kei Vav Kei? Do we know the origin of this name of God? Now, for me, I'm going to say it is in Torah. It actually is from Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, and it is not from the forefathers. It is not from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, last week, I believe I mentioned the book Sefer Yitzira, the book of formation, through which God created the universe. And according to this book, that God created the universe through the Hebrew letters in the Hebrew alphabet, in different forms and permutations of the Hebrew letters in the alphabet. And Yud Kei Vav Kei would be one of those permutations. According to legend and lore, the book, the Sefer Yitzira, was originally composed by Abraham, in his exploration of God and the idea of monotheism, that is, there is a single God. He was able to recognize through nature and through his interactions with the world the way that God manifested in the world, and was able to connect to that deep level and of even the Hebrew alphabet, not the Hebrew alphabet, the Hebrew letters, regardless of the alphabet. This is a much longer conversation. We'll put that to the side. But through the Hebrew letters, and Abraham was able to connect to it, and so he composed a 600-chapter book, which eventually became the 6 chapters of Sefer Yitzira, saying that the rest of the book was lost. Right? Abraham had a lot more knowledge than we learned from him, or that we were able to retain from him, but we retained these 6 chapters. In the Torah, at the beginning of the second book of the book of Exodus, I believe in the 6th chapter, it's actually the Torah reading that we read this past Saturday, God says to Moses, right, Va'er'a, he says, first off, God says to Moses, Ani HaShem, I am Yud Kei Vav Kei. And then he goes on, he says, Va'er'a el Avraham, Yitzchak, ve'Yaakov, bekel Shadkai, u'shmi Hashem lo nodati lahem. And God says to Moses in that moment, I am Hashem. The forefathers knew me as El Shaddai, that is, the God who is responsible for all of creation, and they understood how I expressed myself within creation. But my name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, that which transcends it all and also animates it, that there is this dual nature, that they didn't know. That I did not make known to them. That is, Hashem is saying to Moses, I didn't let them know that you can actually manipulate nature through your relationship to me, right? This sounds very, mystical and all sorts of fun stuff like that, right? There's Jewish magic and all sorts of powerful things. There's actually a whole realm called practical Kabbalah, which is all about people trying to change the world, literally, through use of the Hebrew language. I'll give you an interesting tidbit that if we all know from magic, whenever every magician uses those magic words, abracadabra, whether or not the magician knows it, they are speaking Hebrew, Aramaic actually, but abra is from the word boreh, right? At the beginning of the Torah, it says Bereshit bara. At the beginning, God created. Abra, when you put an aleph on the beginning of a word, it says I. So the word abra means I will create. And then we have the next word is kedabra or kidabra, which comes from the word daber, which means speak. And when we have kidabra, it means as I speak. I will create as I speak is the meaning of abracadabra. So when a magician says, watch me, I'm about to pull a rabbit out of my hat, abracadabra, what's he saying? I'm about to pull a rabbit out of my hat. Now watch me create what I just said I would do. Boom, here's my rabbit, right? Abracadabra. That's really what our tefillot are about. But our forefathers didn't understand that level until Moses. Moses was the one who understood this level of Yud Kei Vav Kei, understood that it transcends the natural flow of the world, even though we recognize it and engage with it through the natural flow of the world. And it recognizes us and engages with us through the natural flow of the world. We recognize there's a transcendent level. So first God says to Moses, I am HaShem. And then after the Exodus from Egypt, God says in the beginning of the 10 commandments, the 10 statements, the dibrot, like kidabra, right? The 10 statements of God. Ani Hashem Elokechem asher tzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim. I am Yud Kei Vav Kei, your God, who took you out of Egypt, who freed you from being enslaved. Right? Nowadays, if we read the news, there's a lot of conspiratorial people out there who are like, we're being enslaved to the powers that be and big pharma and social media and the tech tycoons and blah, 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 blah. Well, even if that's true, remember, we serve HaShem. And HaShem takes us out of Mitzrayim, meaning whatever is going on, go with it. There's no reason to be scared and to fight. Even if there's a big brother out there, there's a big father above big brother, right? And that's, when we talk about HaShem, that's what we're talking about. There is nothing in this world that is beyond this world, and Hashem yet transcends it all.
So, anyway, Rabbi?
Yes.
So you said, and I mean, I'm reading what you said at the beginning of the era here. So you said prior to Hashem saying this to Moshe, the understanding was of his representation as El Shaddai, and you said that is basically God as creator?
Yes.
Okay.
So the Midrash says about El Shaddai, says it is the God who created creation ad shamar dai, right? That Shaddai is an abbreviation of God saying that's enough. Now, what does it mean that's enough? It's like when science talks about, I mean, a lot of theologians talk about this too. I think as a theological argument, it's unnecessary. But anyway, when scientists talk about the idea of an orderly universe, right? That there are very specific parameters that were required from the moment of the Big Bang in order to allow matter to congeal into stars and planets and life the way it has, right? This ordered universe, the specific parameters, that would be under the auspices of the God that said, Shaddai, that it's enough, right? It's not going to be more than this. It's not going to be less than this. It has to be exactly on this point. And that we also talk about that as God Elohim, right? Which I think we said previously is what we often talk about as the Shekhinah, the divine presence in the world, right? When we even think about creation and the way we relate to the God of creation and the forces of nature and creation, that is the name Elohim. Elohim having the numerological connection of Hateva, which means the forces of nature. The fact that it's a plural name is because there are many forces of nature. There is the force of gravity, and there is the strong and weak nuclear forces, and there is the forces of entropy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is the idea of the way that God exists within our limited experience and the way we relate to God within that limited worldly experience. Again, what we call is Mother Nature. So, if anyone wants to talk about the divine feminine in Judaism, Elohim is feminine. Elohim is a she. And that's why she was the one who, as it were, birthed creation. Okay, we're getting a little far right now. We're going to go back into this, though. Actually, it's not going far because that's our next word, is Elokeinu. When we're making this bracha, I bring you, God, source of all things, down into whatever's going on for me right now. Drinking a glass of water or a bottle of water, having a cup of coffee. And we say Elokeinu. And why am I doing it over this thing? Because this is the way you express yourself in this world. This bottle of water has a divine expression. The fact that I drink this water to imbibe it for nourishment, for sustenance, for hydration, all of these things that are essential to life, and you bring it down into this world, that comes from this name Elohim, and you are Elokeinu. We recognize your impact and influence on all of us. And then we say Melech HaOlam, king, which really means in control of, right? The idea of a melech is somebody who's in control of the kingdom. HaOlam is the kingdom. I believe I've said before, maybe not in this class, but HaOlam. Olam is one of my favorite Hebrew words because it has such a duality of meanings. Olam means the world. And when I'm talking about earth, I say this is the Olam, right? And at the same time, if I say something is going to last forever, I also say Olam, Le'olam, right? That is our previous thing at the end of the Baruch Hu, what we said at the end of last week, right? When we say Baruch Hashem Hamborach Le'olam Va'ed, forever and ever, right? Here it says for all eternity. But what is Olam really? Olam is through space and time. Olam, earth, space. Olam, time, eternity. Ultimately, God animates itself through this time and space thing that we live in, that we tend to refer to as Earth or the universe, depending on how broad-minded you're thinking. Now, that is the introduction to every bracha. So if you want to understand what's going on at the beginning of every single bracha that we ever make, that's your introduction. I am connecting to the source of all things with which I have a personal relationship that is defined by this term or this name, Yud K, Vav K. And I have a personal relationship with that transcendent being that is also flowing through all manners of creation and the creative experience, and is the source of that creation and creative experience, which we, and all the forces that enable that lived experience to happen. And it is in charge of that entire creative experience within which I live, that covers all of space and all of time. And I'm going to bring that into whatever's going on for me at this very moment. For me, it was drinking a bottle of water. Okay. That is the introduction of everything going on in every blessing ever. Now, we are going to go into this blessing that introduces the Birkot Kriyat Shema, these blessings of Kriyat Shema. And so again, we're on page 84 or 85 in the English translation of the Art Scroll Siddur with English Hebrew translation following Nusach Ashkenaz. and we say the words yotzer or, which means forms light. Right? Remember that book Sefer Yitzira, which I noted before, the book of formation, right? And that God's first creation was light. Vayomer Elokim Yahi Or, right? It was formed through the sounds of God's speaking, as it were. It's a metaphor. God doesn't have vocal cords, but through God's speaking, or, and creating this thing called light. Then it says Uvoreh Choshech, and created darkness. Oseh Shalom, makes, right? The word oseh is to make something. Peace, right? That's why we don't just have peace with people. We have to make peace with people. It is active. Oseh is an action. I have to do it. And then it says Uvoreh et hakol, and who creates everything. Powerful stuff. But what's it really saying? So again, we have this God of creation, right? The source of it all. Now, when we say there is creation, there are two kinds of creation that Judaism thinks of. There is one which is called ex nihilo, which is something from nothing, and there is something else called ex materia, which is creating something from something, right? Things that we do in this world are something from something. The idea of God's initial creation was something from nothing. I'm not sure if what I'm about to say is accurate. I have to look into it more. But I'm going to conflate on a certain level that the God of ex nihilo creation is the Yud Kei Vav Kei, and the God of ex materia creation is Elokeinu, or Elokim, something from nothing versus something from something. But I'm not going to hold to that. It makes sense. I haven't thought about it enough and reasoned through that concept enough. So I need to look a little bit more into it. Anyway, still happy to say it. I think it makes a lot of sense. Anyway, moving right along. The idea of Yitzira, of formation, is understood to be something from something. And the idea of Beria, creation, is the idea of something from nothing. Remember, abracadabra. What's the magician saying? Nothing in my hat. I'm going to boreh. I'm going to create something from the nothing, right? A rabbit out of my hat. Okay. This hat is great. It's totally invisible. Same with the rabbit. Just throw it over my shoulders. Doesn't matter. Okay. Okay. So Yotzer Or means that light was created from something. There was something before the creation of light. And what do we then have? Boreh, God created from nothing, Choshech, darkness. Ooh, that says that the initial moments of creation were pure darkness. And that's weird because darkness is nothing. There's nothing there if it's purely dark, right? And I'm talking pure darkness, pitch black, right? I'm not just talking the lights are off. We're talking a deeper level of darkness. Now, when it comes to the deeper level of our tefillot, what are we connecting to? What is this experience that we're talking about, that we're all supposed to feel and understand is going on at that moment, at this first moment? Is we're supposed to understand that there's something called darkness, which is a total absence of light, right? There is no light there. It is pure darkness. Now, darkness is often associated with pain, with evil, right? With these harsh, negative kind of associations, right? It's darkness because we can't see what's going on. We can't see what's in front of us. We don't understand it. When somebody falls into depression, one of the biggest symptoms of depression, so much so that there was actually a study that came out of the University of Philadelphia that said that that instead of taking what I'm about to say as a symptom of depression, they said it's the cause of depression, is something called poor future prospection, which is the ability to see a good future, right? Often it's considered somebody in a state of darkness, of inner darkness and depression, can't see anything better down the line. They cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? And the study actually says it's a person's difficulty and inability to see the light at the end of the tunnel that causes depression. Very interesting. Anyway, Monty, you want to ask a question?
I just want to make sure I got this because I think this is crucial. So Yotzer is ex materia,
Yes.
and Vore is ex nihilo.
Yes.
Okay.
And so we say that God created darkness, that the first moment of creation was the moment of nothingness. And then the first thing that God created into that nothingness, utilizing whatever existed within the idea of this space of nothing, was the idea of light.
So I'm sure there are whole books then devoted to why didn't he say darkness first and then light?
Oh, so right. The idea is that almost darkness was the precondition for creation. Now, if we get into the Kabbalistic imagery of it, the way that Kabbalah describes the first moment of creation, it says there was a pure unity that was one and had no difference or distinction, and it went on eternally in all directions. And this thing is called the infinite light of God. And this infinite light, the Or Ein Sof, or the without end, had a, it's interesting the way it says, it arose within the mind. It's a very passive expression. It arose within the mind of the Ein Sof, that it would like to be called by its names Rahum v'Chanun, merciful and compassionate. And so what it did was, in the center of this infinite light, it created, it withdrew, right? It used this constriction. It withdrew the infinite light back to the edges, which is, again, a lot of seemingly contradictions, right? The center of an infinite space is a non-existent thing because it's infinite, so every place is potentially the center. Anyway, this is the language that's used. In the center of this infinite light, it withdrew and contracted the infinite light in order to create a space where there could be such a thing as an other, for which that other could then receive the attribute of merciful and compassionate from this infinite light. With the first thing that it did was it created this void. This is an act known as tzimtzum, of constriction, and it is simultaneously an act of expansiveness and contraction, because expansively it is there to give, specifically for the purpose of given. At the same time, in order to do that, it had to withdraw itself, right? Which is an act of constriction. And then once it created this withdrawal, empty space, it then shot in a kav hayashar, a limited amount of the infinite light, and that infinite amount of, or that finite amount of the infinite light within this void, vacant space, was what enabled creation to happen, right? So when we say that God is and flows through all things, on a certain level, that's what we're talking about, right? That everything that is existed is just the concealed infinitude of God's light in a more manageable, in a more manageable, what's the word I'm looking for? Materials. We're not even at the realm of material yet, but a relatable way, you know, something that we can, that we could interact with, where it won't just blow our minds at all times. Even at that level of kav hayashar, according to Kabbalah, that would still blow our minds at all times. There are, you know, infinite divisions of another 5 levels or 10 levels of creation in order to allow the formation of this being called humanity that has will and intellect of its own and can have something that we refer to as choice. Anyway, moving right along. God was Yotzer Or. How? Because it was Vorech Choshech. Now, we look at these terms also metaphorically. Darkness is that pain, that constriction, that emptiness that a person can feel. But within that, and almost using that, God is able to form light. And the forming of light is the main point of it. We always talk about the light before the darkness. There's actually a phrase called matchilim b'shevach, misaymim bignut. If you have something to say to somebody, always start positive and finish up with more challenging ideas. And this is the idea of shevach. We praise. And remember, even at our Monday class, all these classes are starting to kind of come together. Anyway, at our Monday class about the how-tos of Jewish prayer, we talked about these levels of Jewish prayer. And we said we always start with shevach, with praise. We move into bakasha, desires, request. And we come into a place of hoda'ah, of thanksgiving, right? That's really supposed to be the flow, right? And this is true wherever you go, right? You want to ask somebody for something. You look really nice today. It's great to see you. How's everything going? Oh, I'm so thankful to see you. Listen, could you do me a favor? No. Oh, I'm so thankful. Whatever you can do is great. Thank you so much. It's been really great to see you again. Thank you. Right? This is the way of human dialogue as well. That's the dialogue we have with God too. So again, or is this good stuff, right? Or is the flip side of it? When I talk about light in my life, right? People who love each other, oh, you're the light of my life, right? When we talk about it's feeling lost in the darkness or the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Again, we have this dichotomy, right? Think about the silver lining, right? What's a silver lining? It's when there's a dark gray cloud in the sky and the sun is shining behind it. It gives this kind of silver aura about it, the light that's behind the darkness, right? That's what we're talking about. And then we move on and we say, Oseh Shalom, God who makes peace, God who creates actively peace. But the goal of all of our lives for us to do in the way that God does it, our job is to look at the light and to look at the darkness and make peace. Bring them together, right? The darkness in the creation story is not bad. Yes, it is void. It is nothing. It describes the idea of pain and evil and longing and describes the idea of negativity. But it is also within that and through that we can recognize and embrace the light. And it is from that darkness that we can create more light. And it is upon us to look at everything going on and try to bring it to this balanced center. HaShem Echad. God is one. God is all about unity. And as creations in God's image, right, formed in God's image, right? It's Asher Yatzar et Ha'adam B'Tzalmo, right? That God formed us ex materia in its image, right? That is to be able to see the light, see the darkness, bring them together and make peace between them, recognizing that they are both essential for each other. And then it goes on, it says, Uvoreh et hakol. The same God who does all that is the creator, again, ex nihilo, of everything. That everything goes back to that same source. Bringing us back to that idea, eventually we'll get to in the Shema, that ultimate declaration of HaShem Echad. God is one. God is unity. It's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so if I'm getting this right, there's sort of three, well, maybe Oseh isn't a creative act. Like, I understand when you say um, brings the two seeming opposites together. So I don't know, reconciliation maybe. Where else is Oseh used that might help better illustrate what it means?
So oseh is anything we do actively in this world, right? When we talk about Shabbat, we talk about the last line of the original creation of Shabbat says, that's the thing. We say, Kivo Shabbat mikol melachto asher bara Elohim la'asot. Because God rested, or God stopped or ceased from all of its melacha, from all of the active, creative labor, trying to make something new, that God created, bara, ex nihilo, right? La'asot. And what's the purpose of all of that creative stuff? To make things, right? When we talk about our lives, for me, in my life, one of the things that I do actively is this class, the preparation that goes into this class, and the thought processes that go into it, and the study that I've done over the years, and the spiritual exploration and experiences that I've had, that, and the philosophical explorations that I've had, have brought me to a particular outlook and perspective, and that has brought me to this point where I get to do this. An accountant, right? Their oseh in the world is crunching the numbers and trying to resolve the balance sheet, right? Right. That's the goal, right? Our active and our activity in the world is really about trying to create balance in our lives between the expansiveness of what we want to do in the world and the restriction and the limitations of what the world actually needs and how the world can then receive what we're trying to do. All of these things kind of play hand in hand. They work together. Now, there's a very important thing I want to say here. If we look in the book, and our scroll is very good for this, there's a little superscript number 5 after the word hakol, everything. If we look at that, it's on the English translation side. It takes us to Isaiah 45:7, the book of Yeshayahu, chapter 45, verse 7. Monty, I see you have a Tanakh with you, and you're already flipping there. I have it all set up here because I wasn't sure who would be prepared. So I have it here, so it's now on our screens. This is coming from Sepharia. This blessing is a paraphrase from the prophets of Isaiah. And it's a paraphrase. It is not an exact quote. And we're going to look at this. And the actual quote is Yotzer Or, Uvore Choshech, Oseh Shalom, which we've already seen, right? Forms light, creates darkness, makes peace. Uvore Ra. Oh, what's that? That's not what we said in our blessing. We said Uvore et hakol, right? God who creates everything. Here it says explicitly, God is the same source of evil in the world. God allows evil to perpetuate itself, right? Just like when we talked about the idea of Baruch and bringing it down, we do our best to connect ourselves to the idea of Or, of light, right? The Torah in Aramaic is called Oraita, which means the book of light. Even the word Torah sounds like the word Or, for light. It is about bringing light into the world, bringing down the source, that infinite light, right? The source of all things, down into creation through our berachot, right? But God is also the creator of darkness, which enables light to happen. But then, oseh shalom, what's our goal? How do we do this? By making peace, by bringing it all together, recognizing it all has the same source, and that same source is also the source of even the evil. Why? Because the evil is the choshech. And it goes on, and God himself declares through his prophet, I am God, I am HaShem, I am the source of all things. Oseh chol eleh. I do all of it. Right? So there we see the source of this blessing, that God declares itself to say, I'm also the source of evil. There's something you don't like in this world? Talk to me about it. Let me know. Bring more light into your world by speaking to me, the source, and by connecting to me, the source. Because just as you are connecting to me, the source, for your light, I am also the source of the evil that you are experiencing. So just pick a side, because it's all one. It's all the same thing, right? We tend to think of love and hate as opposites, right? But they're not. They're two sides of the same coin. It's one thing, right? The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is when you don't care, right? Love is a very strong feeling, and hate is a very strong feeling. And we see this a lot, that sometimes we kind of joke about it with little kids, that like when one little kid is kind of bullying and being mean to another little kid, we have to teach them that's not the way. But oftentimes say, oh, they kind of like each other, but they don't know how to deal with those feelings, and so they're being mean, right? Adults certainly do that also. But that's something, right? These are not opposites, they're flip sides. Tov and Ra, Or and Choshech. It's just the other side of the coin, right? It's interesting, today is the day of the inauguration of a president of the United States. Just to date ourselves, for anyone who watches this later, today is January 20th, 2021, and it is the day of the presidential inauguration in the United States for Joe Biden. And we've seen this is a very polarized election and a very polarized result, where there is us and them, and everyone's saying, oh, well, we're good and they're bad, and they're saying, oh no, we're good and they're bad, right? It's very polarized. What's the presidential inauguration supposed to be about? Bringing balance. Doesn't matter if you're right-wing politically, it doesn't matter if you're left-wing politically, because both wings belong to the same bird. And so we all need to fly together, regardless of who's leading the ship right now, and who's turning us this way and who's turning us that way, because we're all going that way. We're just part of the same bird. So you want to lean, try to fine, but recognize we're all in it together. That's the goal. That's the ideal. That's what should be, right? The idea of the polarization is out of balance, because you can't have the two heads fighting. It doesn't work. It's pulling in opposite directions. It needs to be a single entity with a single goal, regardless of how you choose to get there. And so too with light and darkness. It is all sourced in a single entity and has a single goal for us in this world, the idea of shalom, of peace, of making that peace, of bringing everyone together. Right? That is our goal. That is our purpose. That is our desire. Right? When we think about tefillah, we started with the idea of meditation and inner peace. This is our inner peace, achieving the balance between a spiritual life and a worldly life. We're not supposed to extricate ourselves from the world. That is not considered a good thing in Judaism. There is the Nazir, the Nazarite, who dedicates their entire life to spirituality and for a limited period of time. And after their limited period of time, they have to bring a chatat, a sin offering, because it's not the right choice. It's not ideal. That's not what we're going for. We're trying to live in the world, right? And that's the idea. We're trying to use our tefillot to bring us to this place of harmony and peace, recognizing that God is the source of all things. On a historical note, Part of what Isaiah was talking to when he said, when God said through him, I am the God of good and evil. I bring it all together and I make it all together. And I am the singular source of that, is because, especially at the time that he was speaking around 2,600 years ago, he was saying, I live in a polarized world. There are people who are saying that you must worship God because there is a devil, right? Zoroastrianism really picked up on that one, right? The idea of God versus the devil. That's not a Jewish concept. In Judaism, the devil, Satan, simply means the adversary. Also, one of God's angels, one of the way that God engages with the world, one of the forces of Hateva within the realm of Elohim, right? God is the source of that too. And it is just, there needs to be that contra force, the light and the darkness, the good and the evil, right? The love and the hate. These counter forces need each other in order for us to find that harmonized balance and recognize that peace is something we achieve by bringing all those things together and recognizing their singular source in HaShem Echad. God is one. That is why this is the introductory blessing of the blessings, the Birkot Kriyat Shema, because this is introducing us to this idea of how expansive the idea of HaShem Echad really is, how it really comes down into the world in the most profound ways, and how the whole idea is about bringing that balance and that harmony of HaShem Echad. Everything that follows is going to really continue to drive home this point of God's unity and the balance that we work to achieve through our lives, the Oseh Shalom. And that really the way we do that is by acknowledging that everything, the good, the bad, the love, the hate, the things we appreciate and love and make us feel so good, and those things that hurt us and pain us and make us feel so bad, it's all the same source. And we have an opportunity to look to that singular source, and within that, recognize the good that can exist even within the bad, and the bad that can exist even within the good, to take a different culture's form of that idea, or of this idea. It is the image of the yin yang, as we all know, the black that encapsulates a little bit of the white, intertwined with the white that contains a little bit of the black, right? The good and the light and the darkness and the evil that are all part of it, but it is still a singular circle and a singular dynamic that we refer to as HaShem. HaShem would go even beyond just that yin-yang dynamic. It would take it to that next place, saying it's all one. There is no difference or dichotomy between any of it. And it all has a singular source, and that is what we are connecting to. HaShem Echad. Thank you all for joining me for delving deeper into Jewish prayer. I believe I entitled this one on Facebook, God According to God. And as we saw, these are God. This blessing is God's words as it comes out of the prophet. And again, thank you everyone for joining me. We'll be back, please God, next week, same time, Wednesday afternoons at 12 noon on Zoom and Facebook Live. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them on whatever media you're seeing this. And I look forward to seeing you all soon at a future program. Oh, also please do all that stuff you're supposed to do: subscribe, like, share, follow, all of the things. And I look forward to seeing you all next week, either on Monday for my how-to on Jewish prayer, part 3, or the next delving deeper into Jewish prayer. Again, shalom everybody. Thank you for joining me.